Let us now move on to the concept of industrial application. As I mentioned, section 2JA contains the requirement that an invention must be capable of industrial application. In some jurisdictions, this requirement has been coined as utility, that is, the invention must possess utility. The term capable of industrial application has also been defined under section 2AC of the Patents Act. A patented invention must be capable of being made or used in an industry. Courts across the world believe that this is the most lenient of the three requirements of an invention. That is, the threshold for novelty and inventive step are much more difficult to clear as compared to the threshold of utility. The courts have usually taken a very broad view of the terms industry and also the term capable. In a one-line test that you could think of for determining whether an invention is capable of being used in an industry is that whether at the time of the invention there is a sound and concrete basis to conclude that the invention is capable of an industrial application. You would wonder, why is it that we are looking at a sound and concrete basis rather than actual use in the industry for proving whether an invention had utility? You must appreciate that the timeline of a patent application and the commercialization of the product is very important. Typically, a patent application is filed many years before it is actually commercialized. It could even be examined before a product is launched in the market by the patentee. This is particularly true in the pharmaceutical industry, where a number of regulatory approvals have to be obtained before you can commercialize the product. Therefore, for instance, I might develop the product on day 1 and immediately file for a patent. Do you wonder why I would immediately file for the patent? I would have to immediately file for the patent because if subsequently someone else publishes the results of my invention, then it would be novelty destroying and I would not be entitled to a patent. Therefore, typically patentees rush to file for a patent immediately on inventing the same. Then after that the examination of the patent application would take place by the patent office. I would simultaneously start conducting trials in animals and then in human beings to get regulatory approvals for my pharmaceutical. All of this would probably take 5 to 6 years. It is only after that that I will start commercializing my patent after I have obtained regulatory approvals from the drug regulatory authorities. This would mean that at the time when the patent examiner is considering the utility of the patented invention, he does not know whether the commercialization would actually take place, what would be the results of the clinical trials, because there is a time lag between the two. Therefore, the test that the courts have adopted is whether there is a sound and concrete basis at the time when the invention was made to conclude that the invention is capable of industrial application. Let us look at some other tests of this particular aspect of an invention. Firstly, the notion of an industry is considered broadly. It includes all manufacturing, extracting and processing activities of enterprises that are carried out continuously, independently and for commercial gain. Second, it is not necessary that these activities be conducted for profit, and a product can be shown to be useful to cure a rare or orphan disease may be considered capable of industrial application even if it is not intended for use in the trade at all. Thirdly, the capability of industrial exploitation must be derivable by the person skilled in the art from the description read with the benefit of the common general knowledge. Fifthly, the description so read must disclose a practical way of exploiting the invention in at least one field of activity. As I mentioned, there must be a sound and concrete basis for recognizing that the contribution could lead to a practical application in an industry. Next, conversely, the requirement will not be satisfied if what is described is merely an interesting research result that might yield a yet to be identified industrial application. At the same time, the requirement of an utility will not be satisfied if what is described in the patent application is merely an interesting research result, but does not identify a particular industrial application. A speculative indication of possible objectives is not sufficient for satisfying this requirement. You must remember that the purpose of granting a patent is not to reserve an unexplored field of research for the applicant, and is not to give the patentee an unjustified control over others who are actively investigating that area and might eventually find ways actually to exploit it. Therefore, patent law is very careful in giving patents in as yet unexplored areas, because they do not want that the entire area gets reserved for a particular patentee. If a substance is disclosed and its function is essential for human health, then the identification of the substance having that function will immediately suggest a practical application. This is particularly relevant in the pharmaceutical sector, as I mentioned that at the time of the filing of a patent application, at best there are some tests which are conducted in the lab by the patent applicant to determine if a particular activity is observed by a particular pharmaceutical ingredient. There is no test which is conducted on humans at the time of the filing of the patent application. Therefore, at best when the patent application is filed, it only is providing a suggestion that it might be useful for curing a particular disease, but the patent law recognizes this, and therefore does grant a patent even if it is based on such a suggestion. Using the claimed invention to find out more about its own activities is not in itself an industrial application. Finally, it is no bar to patentability that the invention has been found by homology studies using bioinformatics techniques, although this may have a bearing on how the skilled person in the art would understand the disclosure. Now, let us summarize what we have learned today. We first dealt with the concept of an invention. We found there are three essential requirements for a product or a process to be considered as an invention. That is, it must be new or must have novelty, it must have an inventive step, or it must be non-obvious, it must be capable of industrial application, or that it must have utility. You also learnt about section 3 of the Patents Act, which creates a list of items which are not considered as inventions or which are not patentable. The Supreme Court in the Novartis case has clarified that this section 2J, which defines invention, and section 3 create two different tiers for patentability, two separate filters of patentability, and the patentee must clear both to be entitled to a patent. While considering the concept of novelty, you learnt that the test for novelty is that all the elements of the claim must be contained in a single prior art reference. Prior art is everything that is made available to the public before the priority date of the invention, and that written documents are the most commonly used prior art documents. We considered the chair example, and one very important learning that came out of it is that mosaicing is not possible while considering novelty. That is, you cannot combine several documents to destroy the novelty of the claimed invention. We then dealt with the concept of inventive step. To show that a particular invention has an inventive step, the patentee has to show that there was a technical advance over existing knowledge, or that there is some economic significance, and either of these two makes the invention not obvious to a person skilled in the art. This inventive step must be a leap and should not be an incremental obvious improvement over what was known before. We then dealt with the test of obviousness as laid down by the Honorable Supreme Court in the Vishwanath Prasad Radheshyam case. We dealt with the concept of a person of skill in the art, which means a non-inventive person with average normal skills. to determine whether something is obvious or not over existing knowledge. You have to see it from the eyes of a person skilled in the art. We then dealt with the concept of hindsight bias, which you learnt that is a very important concept in patent law, which ensures that the cognitive defect which makes an invention seem obvious after the fact does not come in the way of deserving inventions from being denied a patent. We then dealt with the could would approach, that is, whether a person skilled in the art would have reached the particular solution if he was faced with a problem, rather than if he could have reached to the particular solution when faced with a particular problem. We then learned the concept of teaching away, which means that if there are certain prejudices in the prior art which the patentee has overcome, then such overcoming of prejudice is also rewarded by patent law. We then dealt with the objective indicia of non-obviousness, which help to also overcome the hindsight bias. Objective indicia include long felt unmet need, commercial success, popularity of the invention, etc. We again went back to the chair example and found that the concept of obviousness is very subjective. It depends on who is considering the question of obviousness. We also learned that mosaicing is possible while considering obviousness. We then dealt with the concept of capable of industrial application, which you learnt is the most lenient of the three requirements. The courts have taken a rather broad view of industry and capable. We learned that the person, a patentee, is not required to show actual use in an industry, and in fact you can show, if the patentee can show a sound and concrete basis which can lead one to conclude that the invention is capable of being used in an industrial application, that is usually enough to satisfy this particular requirement. Thank you.